it's important when you move here that you understand the communities that live here and make sure that you're not co-opting these communities. Make sure that you're building with them instead of around it. There's so many lived experiences here and stories and communities that have not always been highlighted, but now they are the past 5 years, and it's amazing.
Hi, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, 30-minute conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 139. There's more information about the podcast at the website, desertladydiaries.com. And to engage with guests, listeners, or me, follow and like Desert Lady Diaries on Instagram and Facebook. If you're interested in submitting a question for an Ask the Host episode, stay tuned to the end of the podcast.
Michelle Castillo is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, educator, and community organizer living on Cahuilla land, also known as Coachella Valley, California. Michelle founded the feminist creative collective Wild Women and socially engaged food plus art plus memory project Lola's Cuisina, and is one of the co-founders of Bayanihan Desert. Through social practice, alternative spaces, and meaningful exchanges, she uses the arts as a tool to cultivate, bridge, and create more inclusive communities. Michelle uses her leadership and voice to serve and uplift marginalized communities. In 2018, Michelle was honored as one of 6 female community leaders by Palm Springs Life Women Who Lead, women who benefit the community and serve as role models in business and life. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course. What was your first experience with desert?
I would say just growing up here, I spent a lot of time living in an intergenerational household. So I wouldn't say per se it's like related to the landscape, but it was related to the home that I grew up in. And I lived with my grandma when I was a child, my Lola, and she would always cook Filipino food, pastries, and I would help her cook. And I think just my memories from being in the desert as a child, it comes from this sense of familiarity and home and coming together as a family and a community. She had many children. She has 10 children. My
Wow.
father is one of them. So every Saturday we would just have lunch at our house. It was just a big part of my childhood, my teenage years. And even though I moved and I left and I lived in several big cities, whenever I would come home for the holidays or just come visit the desert when I was no longer living here at the time, it just really brought me to those memories of coming together with family and also food and this love language of food. Food is a love language, definitely.
Is that what inspired you to start Lola's Cuisina?
Yeah, so Lola's Cuisina, it was inspired by eating at her house. All the children and siblings would come on Saturdays, and it was just a time to unwind and see each other and check in with one another. Like no matter what happened throughout the week, all her sons and daughters, their children would just come and commune in her house and cook food, dance, sing. And it was just very loving and warm. And also I was inspired to be able to share the Filipino culture through food, art, and writing, because it eventually turned into also an art installation as well.
How did your grandmother and mother come to the United States?
Most of my family arrived here because they came through military. So my great-grandfather, he was a U.S. Captain Army. His name is John Love, and he petitioned his children, grandchildren to come here. So it was through the military.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed in your bio, and when I read it, that you honor the fact that this is Cahuilla land.
Yes.
For someone listening who's not familiar, can you describe a little bit about why it's important to you to honor them?
Right. I think it's important, as someone whose family migrated here, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the indigenous peoples whose land that we live on since time immemorial. We are living on indigenous land, and to understand the history of that and that this is their land.
Which is a big part of, I think, why now we do Indigenous People's Day instead of Columbus
Hmm.
Day, with him coming and kind of
Yes.
colonizing, if you
Hmm.
will. Yeah.
Right. I was born and raised here in America, but my family migrated from the Philippines, and there's a big history of colonization and imperialism there. So as I continue to grow older, that is something that has been rooted in my organizing and how I show up in the world, of also decolonizing. And getting closer to the indigenous practices in the Filipino culture as well, because I think it's so important to go back to our roots and where we come from and understand where we come from. Also, where are we living and how are you showing up in the world, especially wanting to decolonize from, I would say, white supremacy and that mindset and those values of Western thinking of individualism, colonialism, ego. Um, Being that I grew up in a family that was always very communal, collaborative,
Mm.
it was no mistake that as I got older, I was seeking those kind of spaces to build community within the spaces I ended up in, or the spaces I would cultivate was always about coming together, and seeing each other as humans, holding space for one another, listening to each other's stories, and making sure everybody is heard and seen is something that's important to me.
And I think it's important for everyone to, it's coming together and being able to share stories helps us to understand the backgrounds of where someone else came from and maybe why they interact the way they do or why they show up in the world the way they do.
Sure.
And having those conversations, we find that we are more alike than we are different. You know, the differences may be cultural or customs and things like that, but at the heart of
Hmm.
it, the human side of it, we're all experiencing that.
Yeah, everybody is, there's humanity in each of us and compassion and love. And I think it's important to see that. Um, but also, I do believe that there's still systemic racism. I know myself as a brown woman with dark skin, I will never be white passing or white adjacent, nor will I have light skin privilege. And I think it's important for us to discuss the intersections of what's happening, the things we need to change now. This should have been changed a long time ago.
for someone for someone who's listening who is white, are you comfortable sharing an experience that you've had where you've been made to feel less than, to bring that understanding to someone who hasn't had that experience?
Sure. I mean, each day that I live in who I am, although I do have privileges of being educated and cultured and whatever, I've been able to have opportunities. But again, like I said, I go through microaggressions that turn into macroaggressions. People treat you differently because of the way you look or your skin tone. And I think it's important that folks need to acknowledge that it's not okay to treat others that look different, treat others badly or disrespectful just because they look a certain way or you don't have the same skin. There's a caste system in a sense when I think of that, even in Black and Brown communities, where the darker the skin you have, the more inferior you are. The lighter the skin, even though you are within that community, there is some kind of privilege. Colorism, I would say.
Right. Yeah. Thank
Hmm.
you for explaining that. So you grew up in the valley,
Sure. Yeah,
but then you left the valley in
I did.
your 20s. Was that
Yeah.
was that for schooling? Was that, wow, there's nothing here for me, I need to go elsewhere and find my people, find activities, find
Hmm.
myself? What was it about that you left?
Yeah, I left the desert because I didn't quite see myself growing here. There wasn't a thriving arts and culture community that I found myself a part of yet. The leadership didn't look like me for the most part. It was predominantly white. I was looking to expand and get out of the desert. And whether it was going through college or having experiences that were different than what would have been offered if I stayed here. So when I think of that, my time living in big cities were very formative, and it shaped what I wanted to make in the next chapter of my life. So yeah, I needed to leave. It allowed me to grow and expand in ways that I felt that wouldn't have allowed me if I stayed here in the desert.
Did you find that when, I mean, I guess we'll get to like why you returned, but when you returned, did you find any of that change a little bit? Like you were saying, the leadership was white and things like that. How long were you gone, and did anything change in a better direction?
Sure, I came back in around 2015, and it's been about 5, 6 years now. And yes, of course, things became more progressive, more inclusive. A lot of folks my age who left for college when they were 17, 18, we all came back because there was something perhaps we wanted to give back to the community that wasn't there, or we wanted to just go back to the community where we grew up in. And oftentimes, when I first came here, there were spaces that I didn't quite see yet. So when I think about what does it mean to navigate space and build space for people who are marginalized, historically marginalized, whether it's women, non-binary folks, BIPOC folks, I think it's important to, if those spaces aren't there, you should make them. Don't wait a few years. Like, if just make it. I think it's important to create your own narrative in the spaces that you want to exist in.
And I just wanted to go back to something you said. You said BIPOC folks, and for anyone who's listening, that is Black, Indigenous people of color.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So is that why you came back to the Valley to do that? Or were there other circumstances that drew you back?
I think it's so interesting because, like, when I think of the desert and coming back, many times, ooh, the desert, it's very romanticized, and
Especially these days.
especially where you all live up in the high desert.
Yes.
So it's very like it's just so dreamy, and I
Right.
want to
And we
just
all wear flowing
go.
dresses and straw hats and sunglasses, which I don't.
Right, right. But when I think of that, it's like it's so much more. There's so many lived experiences here, and stories and communities that have not always been highlighted, but now they are the past 5 years, and it's
Mhm.
amazing. And like as we mentioned, we are on Indigenous land. I am calling from Kauai land here in Palm Springs, which is sekhe, originally boiling water. And for us to acknowledge that this is Indigenous land and that they've lived here since time immemorial and created their histories and stories here. So to think of the desert as this romantic, blank, open, vast space, I think, yeah, sure, many times people think of that. Even sometimes I'll be like, you romanticize this dreamy open space, but when you come here, it's like there's history here. There's amazing history here and stories here that have been here for centuries. And I think it's important when you move here that you understand the communities that live here and make sure that you're not co-opting these communities. Make sure that you're building with them instead of around it. So I think when I moved back here, I I don't know. I was in love with the city, and I didn't really have to move back here. Actually, I didn't want to. I love the culture. I love the art. I was in love. My life was on this kind of linear path of, okay, you got a great job. I was teaching inner city school, and I taught there for a while. Like I said, I was in love, had my first live-in relationship, and I was thinking we're gonna have kids. We're gonna move into this loft we talked about. And, there was just, it didn't happen that way. I mean, life had something else for me. And I realized life is not linear. It's non-linear, and it's messy, and it's beautiful in that way. So, just one summer from my teaching, that person and I parted ways, but I knew there was something deeper. It wasn't just that long-term relationship ending. There was something deeper that was calling me just to come back. And next thing you know, I was heading on the I-10 and the pavement just went back to sand again. And here I was back home.
Right.
Yeah. And I was like, whoa, it's hot out here.
Yeah.
No longer foggy like San Francisco.
No, you probably
Yeah.
have a whole wardrobe change.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So, talk to me about Wild Women with an X
Sure.
and how that got started for people that are listening. I know that there are folks here that are familiar with the organization up here in the high desert, but we have some listeners that are not even here in the high desert. So, if you could just talk about how that organization came to be and what kind of things you all do together.
Yes, thank you for asking. So, Wild Women is a feminist creative collective. It's comprised of women artists, writers, performers, just multidisciplinary artists and activists. And when I first moved back here around that time, I was looking for feminist and radical and inclusive spaces where we were demonstrating community care, collective care, mutual aid, and what does it mean to be seen? What does it mean to hold space and show up for one another? I wanted to create a space that had accessible and inclusive programming that focused on intersectional feminism, activism, the arts, wellness, and creating sustainable communities. So I wanted to find a space where we can have those conversations and cultivate creative skill sharing and collaboration. And yes, I would say consciousness raising. So it reminded me a lot of like the freedom schools from the 60s and 70s where folks were producing knowledge and sharing knowledge, but there wasn't really one teacher. We were all learning from one another as women, trans women, and non-binary folks. We were learning from one another. It was like this shared space of skill sharing and collaboration.
For someone like myself who travels in pretty white circles,
Hmm.
have a sprinkling of BIPOC friends, do you have recommendations for people like me to get more involved in those spaces? Sometimes it feels like it's hard, number one, and of course it's going to be, but just getting familiar with I don't want to call it a language, but I guess it is, like things like BIPOC and
Hmm.
non-binary, and using the right terms and not
Sure.
misstepping and saying something that I don't personally realize is a microaggression, but it is to someone else. I mean,
Yeah.
what kind of things can folks do to educate themselves?
Right. I think it's important if you're in a space, perhaps that is queer, intersectional, what are to respect people's pronouns? What are your pronouns? Are they she, hers, they, them? How can I respect you in that way? And so, by the way, Wild Women is a multicultural, multi-ethnic. So it's all folks from different backgrounds and cultures and races. And I think that's very beautiful. Most times, feminist spaces, especially back in the 60s and 70s, the feminist movement was mostly white and upper middle class women. So, Black and brown women had to create their own spaces, womanism for our Black women. There were Chicana spaces. And I think those were necessary as well. But what happens, and it's 2016 we started, there are still other spaces where it's like only for BIPOC women or women of color. But I think what was so interesting about Wild Women is that we did birth a multicultural space. And I think it's very beautiful in that way where we are learning about one another, we're respecting each other through our stories, we're listening, especially our members would be listening to our BIPOC members and not having to burden them also in a way where, like you said, you want to feel like it's equal exchanges of learning and sharing space instead of, let's say, like one person doing all the work. So I do believe in creating a space that feels safe where everybody can learn. And we have Feminist Book Club. We've had that for 4 years. And that is a space for all the members in our collective or interested folks. And we've been talking about race, class, gender, accessibility, feminist theory for the past 4 years. And, there's been people like coming to these realizations like, oh, I didn't know, or I'm so glad I am learning now. Thank you. I'm sorry. Listen to me, or I'm listening to you for the first time, maybe, And I think it's really, like I mentioned, gosh, it wrecks my heart to see so much hate and division. But how do we heal?
Mhm.
And how do we create these spaces where everyone is seen, held, can share their stories? And I think that's what Wild Woman has done for the past 4 years.
So if someone was interested in participating in the collective, is it like a membership? How do they get
Sure.
involved? How does that all work?
Yeah, we do have a membership. When we first started in 2016, I did not have a membership model. I used time banking
Oh,
and creative skill sharing and knowledge share, which is what we still do, but everything was free. So,
that can
and I
only go
still,
so far.
I can only go so far. And I know if you're a creative or an artist, you're listening to me right now. So I think it's still important to have accessibility. So when we did start our membership model, we still allowed folks to demonstrate time banking, which is exchanging of time for services. Because I don't believe that money is everything. I believe that there can be alternative economies where that we can share and create together without money, especially for those who may not be able to access it in that way. But if you'd like to do a membership model, it starts as low as like $10 a month, and then it goes on. But right now we're kind of just doing donation based. We have all our offerings, but everything is based on donations because it's COVID. Folks are having a hard time. And then also, if you cannot make a donation, we don't turn any away for lack of funds for our offerings. So right now, this month, we have a full moon circle. We have our creative writing group that meets once a month. We have feminist book club and all things queer for our queer folks, a space to be. Yeah.
Where do they go to get more information about Wild Women?
You can go to Instagram. We keep our Instagram very updated with our calendar, our programming. So that's Wild Women, WYLDWOMXN, or wildwomen.com.
Thank you.
You can also email us as well.
Cool. So I think that there's a similar thread between the two of us and probably many of the listeners is that we are multi-passionate. We have
Sure.
many things that we do. We work for a job and we create, and there are many things that we do. What kind of advice do
Mm.
you have for, say, someone who's 18 or 19 and realizing, like, well, I love music and I love photography and I love community organizing and I want to be activist? All these things,
Yeah.
that we all want to do. What is some advice that you could give someone who has those ideas and needs?
Right. I think it's important to continue to think of yourself as like this multi-passionate, multifaceted person and to be okay with it. Because it does seem a lot for folks who exhibit those kind of skills, or they're wanting to make sure that all their passions and dreams are gonna be able to sustain themselves. So the advice that I would give is just keep doing it. Keep doing what you're passionate about, whether it's art, music, organizing, because you'll find a way one day where they're all just going to come together. Because I believe nothing ever happens in a vacuum, they're all connected. So I think Wild Women, Lola's Casina, my work that I do with organizing or building community spaces, they've all stemmed from wanting to build spaces that didn't exist or spaces that should exist, and what does it mean to take up space in these spaces as well. As I go back to my family, growing up in my other project, Lola's Casina, it was very much like that. It was filled with a lot of love and joy, but also it's very communal, always ate
Mhm.
together, everywhere together. So I feel blessed to be able to grow up in a household that had many generations in it, instead of just my mom and dad and my siblings. So it's really cool to grow up with my grandpa, my grandma, and then maybe like my aunt. But then everyone eventually moves out of the house and have their own lives. But when they first came to America, some of them lived together because that's just how it is. So I think, yeah, that thing of wanting to create community and to have those moments of just being together really did stem from growing up in that family.
Mm. And I think sometimes it's just starting small and starting where you are. Sometimes there are people that have in their heart that they feel like there's something they could do to change the world, but you have to start somewhere and start
Mm-hmm.
small. And if you start small and maybe someone else sees what you're doing, they'll be inspired to start, and someone else will be inspired. And before you know it, it starts to grow into a larger.
Web
Yeah, exactly.
network.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was kind of been reflecting now on kind of the question you had mentioned on like how would one or how do we continue this kind of work? What needs to be done now? And I think listening is important. Really having those moments to listen, sit, and be present with someone who doesn't look like you or who doesn't have the same background. When I think of how we can come together, sometimes we live in these echo chambers. Everyone is legit just shouting. And I was like, how radical would it be to actually storytell and listen and show up, be present with people who may have different views and perspectives, and to be okay with that? Because we live in this world where we only want to keep ourselves in like little enclaves, but it's like, how beautiful would it be to open, to spread, but then also come back together and be a more diverse community.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to be here today. I know that there are many women up here in the high desert who are aware of Wild Women, and some of them may have
Oh,
actually
cool.
come down and participated. So,
Yes, we do have some high desert folks, which is I'm excited. We got a bunch this summer because we're based in the Coachella Valley and we do have this mountain in between us. So it's really nice that all our programming now is currently online. So we had someone join from Texas. We had our anti-racist reading group and someone all the way from Texas found us. And I was like, how awesome, you
that's
know?
very cool. Yeah, exactly. So, even
Yes.
starting small, and now with this, it is spreading. Do you know?
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, I don't know, we don't know what's going to happen with this pandemic, but we're thinking if things do move forward in a way that is more where we can see each other in person, we would still offer like a hybrid model, perhaps, and maybe have online offerings and in person. Because
Hmm.
if folks have come to learn our space, we've been online since March.
Wow.
It's been wild. When the pandemic hit, I knew I had to stabilize and organize the communities that I was accountable to and to make sure that they had spaces to connect and engage. So I put everything online. That wasn't easy because we're so super in person, and
Mm,
in person interactions are important.
yeah.
I was like, okay, well, if the space is still needed, we'll do it online. And it is. So here we are.
That's awesome. And did you have an actual physical space down in the lower desert? Or did you just meet at different places?
Right. Yeah. We had a few community contracts. Our monthly gathering was at the Ace Hotel in Palm Springs. So that was once a month. And then we also offer our LGBTQ group offering was at the center in Palm
Hmm.
Springs.
Yeah.
And we also ran our art in studio practices was running out of Create Studios in Palm Desert. So we had these partnerships throughout the community. So the women were going, yes, to different spaces, but it was always grounded. When I first started, we were just meeting in homes, in backyards, at parks,
Mm-hmm.
anywhere public, or that whole thing of coming to other women's homes. And that felt very intimate, but also special too. But as we grew, we started meeting in public buildings.
Places. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. Well, and it's exciting.
Yeah.
It's probably exciting for you to see what you started with and where it's come in 4 years.
Yeah, I can't believe it's been 4 years. This past year, we started a mutual aid fund for our members who were deeply impacted by COVID-19. So we were able to raise funds to give to the women artists in our collective. That has been really helpful. And then in the summer, we raised another round of funds. So we started a micro grant initiative specifically for BIPOC women and non-binary folks because they're often overlooked in the grant process. So we had small micro grants. We're just winding down that cycle. And I'm kind of looking right now, we are fiscally sponsored, but the leadership team, we're looking at getting our full 501c3 if that's what it's looking like towards the end of the year. Yeah, it's really just been this special place for women and non-binary creatives to uplift one another and to create, to collaborate, to listen, and have camaraderie. And, oftentimes these feminist spaces are like girl power or just empowerment. But, I think it's important to also understand, where is that power coming from? How are you using it? And how are you building it with others, not just for yourself?
Yeah.
Because goodness, that's horrible. Oftentimes it's just coming from the ego when I think of power, but I think true power is when you share it with others and you make sure they feel empowered and they take leadership roles. If you're in a certain space, if you're uplifted, make sure you're uplifting others at the same time. Because it's never okay just to uplift yourself.
Thank you. And thank you for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and have this conversation.
Thank you, Dawn, for having me.
You're welcome. But before I let you go, what we typically do at the end is I'm going to choose 2 chips from the magic jar, and that will give us 4 questions for our Diary Unlocked episode, which is available only to Patreon supporters of the podcast. So if you're listening and you would like to be a Patreon supporter of the podcast, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support tab, and you'll have instructions there on how to become a patron. The questions I'm going to be asking Michelle are, how do you define success?
That's always a fun one. Yeah.
Do you have a meditation or gratitude practice you'd like to share? How would your best friend describe you?
Do I answer all 3?
We're going to have one more.
Oh, okay.
1 year from now, what will you be celebrating? So if you would like to hear Michelle's answers to those questions, again, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support tab, and sign up to be a Patreon member. Thanks again for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, so last year, near the end of the year, I did a Ask the Host episode. I'm thinking about doing that again if I get enough questions. So if you all have some questions that you would like to ask me, send those questions to desertladydiaries@gmail.com and put Ask the Host in the subject line of your email. And I will put all those together and make that maybe the last episode of this year. And if you'd get those to me by November 20th, that would give me plenty of time to record an episode with answers. This podcast is funded through the generosity of listeners like you. If you'd like to learn how you can chip in, visit the website desertladydiaries.com and click on the support page. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.